Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast, the podcast all about the delicate balance between people and business, and quite literally, reconnecting the two. My name is Tracy Rubin, and I've spent nearly my entire professional career in HR. Join me as I share stories, opinions, and words of advice with you each week. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. You know the drill. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you are listening to or watching this episode. This week, I have Rhonda Robinson on. She is a certified professional in talent development, aka a CPTD, and a master performance consultant. She's won numerous awards, published multiple articles, and has been recognized for accelerating performance for a spectrum of large to small companies. She's a keynote speaker and has conducted custom workshops across the globe. In fact, Rhonda has been featured on USA Today, NBC, CBS, Fox News, Startup Today, The Businesswoman Today, and London Business Magazine. And if that doesn't excite you the way it excites me, then I don't know what will. She is the founder of Retain My Team, which we'll be speaking about a lot today, which is a cutting-edge yet practical framework of tools that helps companies attract and retain employees, which we all know is the name of the game, especially today. Retain My Team is designed with a blend of neuroscience, how the brain works, the art of performance improvement, how people work, and a splash of creative thinking. Rhonda has a mission to infuse more humanity into the workplace. Why? Because everyone wins. Happy employees stay and companies are more profitable. So you all know already that this is my jam, right? Like this, we are really going to dig into the Great Resignation and work cultures and things like that. So I know you'll enjoy. So stay tuned. Without further ado, here we go. Welcome, Rhonda, to the podcast. Rhonda, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really glad that we were able to make time to connect. And I think that you're going to offer a lot of interesting insights to the listeners today. So why don't you start off by telling us where you're podcasting with me from and a little bit more about what you do.
Thanks, Tracy. I think that we could probably talk all day because we have very synergistic missions and overlapping goals and topics of interest. So I'm really looking forward to spending this time with you. I'm dialing in from the San Francisco Bay Area. Actually, I can see the San Francisco Bay right outside this window.
Ooh.
Got a nice view, which helps as we work from home to take those little mental breaks occasionally, which are very important.
Totally. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about how we take some mental breaks even further into our conversation, just given, what you do and what your company is focused on and how you actually build the tools that you have. So actually with that, why don't we segue into the reason why the listeners are here today, which is really to hear from you about how you bring neuroscience and workplace and all of these things, culture, everything comes together for you in bringing more humanity to the workplace, which, from our initial conversation, that was the hook, line, and sinker for me when you and the team reached out, because there's nothing better than that. So walk us through how you really developed Retain My Team, your business, and what you're doing.
Sure. So, for the audience that is in the HR and talent acquisition space, training and development space, we're in a unique position because people tend to tell us things that they don't tell other people. They don't tell their manager. They might not tell other colleagues. And we really get a peek under the hood as to what they love about a company, things that make them upset, what are good managers, what are not so good managers. In terms of organizational change, what are the triggers that really set people off and running for the door? So, in the 20 plus years that I've been in the training and talent development space, I've been seeing trends over time. And I recall being at a company that was going through some change and the distress that I saw everywhere that I looked. And I thought there has to be a better way because the company as a whole was not handling it well from the people side. And so I'm a perpetual learner. And so I started digging into what else can there be? Is there something else out there that we can tap into? And about that same time, there was a lot of work being done in behavioral neuroscience and how people think, act, and behave in social settings, and work is a social setting, right?
Totally.
Yeah. And so I just became such a fan. And as the work evolved, I evolved with it and took the little pearls that I could apply on my job with my team. And, and I've always been in the startup pharma and biotech space. And what happens is you're successful and you get bought, or you're not so successful and you go looking for another opportunity. I started to see trends company to company to company. And although I was bringing forward some of these techniques and mindsets for impacting my little team, I finally had an aha moment and said, why am I keeping this to myself? There are so many companies, so many people, so many managers and leaders that are looking for more. They want to do right by their people. But along the way, I have always been interested in performance improvement and earned certifications, not only in the talent development space, but also as a certified master performance consultant. And I found that if I tried to do one side, neuroscience, without the other side, performance improvement, there was always a gap. Why is that? Well, neuroscience is based on how the brain works, and performance improvement or performance consulting is all about how people work. And so when you put those two together, you bring the natural things that is happening at a subconscious level together with practical, pragmatic tools that can be measured and applied.
Super interesting. I don't know that I've really met many people that think about, some of the challenges in the workplace from that level of humanity, because, a lot of what we talk about, especially at the HR level, is how people think, not necessarily how the brain works, which is a little bit different. It's the difference between neuroscience and psychology, I guess. Not that I'm an expert, but if I'm, really trying to generalize, that would be my sweeping generalization, is that that's one of the fundamental differences. And I guess it leads me to one of my first questions for you from a tactical standpoint, which is thinking about when someone does decide they want to be part of the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle or the Great Realignment, whatever we want to call it. What, from your perspective, can that candidate do to really think through and identify whether the culture is the right fit for them based on, these things that you're taking into consideration, assuming that a business has maybe applied that same type of thought?
That's an outstanding question, Tracy. So just like pursuing any kind of job or career, it starts with self-awareness. People usually think, what kind of job do I want to work? What kind of pay do I want to make? What location is it in? All these different kind of very tangible, obvious things. But what's happening right now is, let's start with why the Great Resignation is happening. The parent-child relationship of employers and employees is dead. Employers have had the cards since the industrial age. Why? Because people needed jobs. And often they had little golden handcuffs with the promise of pensions, or perhaps it was the only factory in town. But for 100 years, work has evolved, but the way we have relationships with our employer has not evolved. And so the pandemic in particular, plus some of the financial things that have taken place in the world, have really shown a spotlight on what's truly happening in the workplace. People aren't robots. They can't just check their feelings in their personal lives like a coat at the door when they clock in for work.
Totally.
They're still the same people on the clock and off the clock. And we've been conditioned as a society, like, shh, don't talk about personal things at work. Leave that outside the doors. So don't talk. It's like you have to leave a part of yourself somewhere else when you go to work. What's happening? Usually it's not a single event that drives people out the door. There's something icky, and icky means something different for each person, but there's something icky that is happening to them at work. And so they finally reach a tipping point and they leave. Yes, some people are leaving for better salaries, different benefits, maybe remote or hybrid work. But when they interview, they're on high alert looking around for, is there icky here? Because they want to avoid the icky. But an interview is a false positive environment on both sides. I'm a great employee. We're a great place to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so both sides are hoping it works out. And then an employee starts a new job, and all of a sudden, there's the icky. And so this is where we're in this great reshuffle. People are trying to play musical chairs, trying to find that one chair that works for them. I like to think of it more as, if you really understand how people work and how the brain works, now we have an opportunity to have the great alignment. So coming full circle to being self-aware. Often people can't articulate what is that icky that they ran away from. If they can't articulate it and they don't know what the icky is, how will they know if they're in the right spot, in a good fit with the next job that they have? And that's where understanding the neuroscience, what's going on subconsciously in your brain with how people work, the obvious things, salary, benefits, perks, logistics of the job, fit together and must fit together. Otherwise, we're going to continue in the great reshuffle.
So how do you get leaders to care about the way that the brain works, to care about the way that their employees think or future employees think? Because if you ask the majority of leaders that are potentially out there, the reason why coaching even exists today, I think, is because the majority of leaders probably have this feeling or emotion toward leadership in the sense that it's like, they have a job to do, they have a business to run, and they care about people. I believe that the majority of people majority of leaders do care about their employees. I'm not saying that they don't and they're apathetic. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But I do think the majority of leaders are probably thinking to themselves, even if they heard this episode, well, that's not what I'm getting paid to do. I'm getting paid to drive a business, to do this or to do that. And I care. I want them to have a good experience. I want them to enjoy where they're working. I don't want them to leave, but I don't know that I want it to be that deep, right? Like that, I can hear former coworkers saying that to me as an HR person when I tell someone you need to dig in deeper, for example. So how do you get the buy-in from those people? And maybe they're not the majority. I think that most people would say that it's, they are not in the business or in a leadership role to figure out how the brain works. How does anyone that cares about this drive the buy-in and get the buy-in so that there is some sort of approach to appreciating and understanding that the brain works in mysterious and different ways?
That's right. That's right. I truly also believe that leaders do care about their people, but there's a couple of things in play. You mentioned a couple of them. They are there and measured on driving results. They're busy, especially if they're short-staffed during this great resignation and reshuffle. Their heads down, just trying to stay afloat. And number three, it takes a lot of work to change your mindset and think of what else you should be doing and then execute those things, all while you're trying to keep these other things moving. So the key is to give leaders tools that have the underpinnings of neuroscience, but show up as very practical things. If this, do that. And so we do the thinking for you. We understand how the brain works. We understand how people work. And we have identified the triggers and situations where these are needed the most. And you don't have to focus on everything for everyone. We've narrowed it down to the CARES model. And CARES are simple things that when you hear them, you're going to go, yes, that's what people do care about. So it's things like certainty, autonomy, relationships, equality, and their perceived standing among one another and within the organization. And again, just having very practical tools of how to keep the positivity around these 5 different things moving in your team and in the organization. And I'm happy to say, too, that we're moving to some technology that will automate a lot of this stuff. Nice. We're so excited to talk about that, that it even further takes the thinking out of it. And because you're right, changing the mindset is hard, and we're all wired differently. Mm-hmm. Leaders have very different styles. Some are very empathetic leaders naturally. Others care, but they don't show up with Hallmark cards and bleeding hearts. It's just not them. So Why make them be that way? That doesn't mean they can't do things on a daily basis to show up as empathetic leaders, but they can do it without those Hallmark cards and bleeding hearts.
Totally. And empathy, I mean, our reactions are so personal. Maybe it's not even empathy. It's really what we commit to when it comes to where we spend our energy. And it's interesting because my in thinking about this question that I asked you about, how leaders how you get the buy-in from leaders who have that mentality. And it's not to say that that's the wrong mentality. It's just what they potentially were taught matters, that everything comes second to the business, or whatever that means today, or for them. And one of the things that I was thinking about as you were sharing, especially in this CARES model, which I know we'll get to, is that if people, leaders today, are learning habitually how the brain can impact, or how people are impacted by their upbringing, by their challenges, by the things that they've experienced. But I was thinking about, like, in your first job, when you are trained on how to execute your job and to meet the core responsibilities of your job, if part of the training is how you interact with others, I would imagine that if people received the right training that gives them the tools and the resources that you're talking about, then actually there wouldn't be as much of a need for buy-in. The perspective today is that employees are most engaged when compensation, benefits, and culture are right. But actually, I think there are more pillars to employee engagement. I think self-determination and flexibility are really important. Appreciation and value, or feeling valued in an organization, whether that's recognition or otherwise, those things are just as important to employee engagement, and that we learned from the pandemic most clearly. And it's why I think one of my next questions, hopefully you'll elaborate on this as well, but it's why I think the Great Resignation will probably continue for a long time until businesses really start to hear and listen to the feedback that is pretty pervasive, which is that people want more than just pay, benefits, and a good culture. They want a lot more than that. I'd love to hear from you why you think, or if you think, the Great Resignation has potentially no end in sight.
Something has to change, otherwise it will never end. The key is that we need to be having these candid conversations about these triggers of behavior. For example, early on, if you can lay out to your manager your overall orientation towards autonomy, and you have those continuous conversations throughout your career, it's no different than talking about a flexible schedule. I'll give you an example. I'm a very high autonomy driven person. Oh, surprise. That's why I have my own business now, right?
Right.
But sometimes I forget that other people don't, or maybe something has changed and they don't want as much autonomy. So I was leading a team. We had a new team member, and she was the newest to the group. And I was giving her some tasks, high autonomy, and letting it run. And she came to me and she's like, you know what? I just really could use more guidance, more oversight. Would you please check my work until I kind of get up and running? And it was a bunker idea for me, a bunk on the head for me. And like, oh yeah. So having that conversation, it's a two-way street. Here's what I'd like to do is just give you this list and you go run with it. But offer, hey, but if you have something that you need to check in with me, feel free. Actually, we provide a tool that quantifies how much autonomy someone thinks they have right now over the time, the tasks, and the team that they work with, as opposed to how much they want to have. And then you can have that conversation back and forth, and it liberates everyone on both sides. The manager feels a comfort level, and the employee feels a comfort level as to how much hands-on or hands-off is needed at a given moment.
And actually, I'm looking at my notes, and this triggered a memory for me from our initial conversation, which I wrote down because I thought it was so interesting. And it's this concept and realization, really, that you've made that candidates and people, let's just say people, today don't really have a way of articulating what they care about or what they need or what they're driven by. And I had an opportunity to take the CARES survey, if that's the correct phrase, or the survey, the assessment, and autonomy, as I knew, was the most important thing for me. And it's probably why I am already in my podcast land for almost 2 years now. But anyway, I digress. This point, again, the articulation in interviews, this is specifically what I wrote down, articulation in interviews of what went wrong at a previous employer or at a current employer, or what you need that's new, but then isn't necessarily able to be articulated by that person. So if you and I are in an interview together and I can't communicate to you that in my previous role, I didn't have a whole lot of autonomy, and that's something that's super important to me, then it's just this really potential for me to go back into that quote unquote icky environment that I didn't so much appreciate before. And this is it's such a revelation for me, because actually I think we all at some level within our career struggle to articulate what we want, what we need, what we don't want, what we don't need, and even sometimes what we do or what we prioritize. So thinking about CARES, which again, for all the listeners, is certainty, autonomy, relationships, equality, and standing, thinking about how we can figure out within that assessment, within the survey that you offer, that can help us to articulate especially what we need and need to look out for in an environment. So when we kind of splice that out and let's say, a listener decides to take the CARES survey and finds out that equality is really important to them, for example, what are some questions that they can ask that will specifically tell them whether or not they're going into an environment that's actually going to support them the way that they actually need to be supported?
And that's the whole point, right? Is to start having these deeper conversations, even in the interview process. What you're looking for is to find a match. So even for all these 5 acronyms, they mean different things to different people. For some people, equality means being included. For some, it means equal pay. For some, it means equal opportunity for advancement or to learn and grow in their role. And that's where the self-awareness and self-assessment can come into play, is if you can sort through the icky to find what you really need, you can ask very pointed questions about that. Certainty is a big one. I had the opportunity to have a chat with a candidate who took the survey as well, and she was talking about how her last company, they were just a mess. They couldn't figure anything out. Everything was upside down and crazy. She was very high for certainty. But if you went into that interview and said, my last company was a hot mess, they're upside down and crazy, they don't know what they're doing, that would sound bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be like, is she going to talk bad about us? But that's her icky. Instead, we can drill down. And she could understand that perhaps she craved more communication, that perhaps she was someone who liked more frequent interactions, and in a remote environment, a forced remote environment, didn't have access or didn't feel like she had access to the people she needed to talk to get answers. And so we also give tips for people to self-manage around that. If you need certainty, don't wait for someone to come and tell you what to do. It's on your shoulders, to the best of your ability, to go seek out that information, to find closure so that you can move forward. You're not paralyzed by indecision.
Right. This made me think about specific industries, and that it's probably helpful for candidates to know themselves really well when they are in interview processes. Because, for example, if someone really craves certainty, a startup is probably not the place for them, because there is no certainty in a startup other than that there's a lot of work to do. And, if you don't have a whole lot of clarity on what that looks like, you could feel totally lost in the sauce. And then similarly, if someone really wants and appreciates autonomy, but they don't have leadership experience yet, they're probably not going to experience that autonomy just yet until they build a certain level of trust and credibility. And so all of these things make me think about the candidate experience really first and foremost. And of course, I see the benefits too for the interviewer, and naturally, which I'll get to in a second, but for the candidate to really know themselves. And coming back to this point on self-awareness that you made before, self-awareness is not very common. And I guess it's really where surveys like the surveys that you have can help people to navigate what they need and what they desire, just in answering questions about themselves. And then on the flip side of that, for the interviewer, it makes me think about candidates that have been written off before. We've all been there where we're like, not the right person for the role, not a value add, or not this or not that. But maybe it's just that what they communicate isn't exactly what we're expecting, or because we prioritize something. Like maybe when I interview a manager, I want someone to be super autonomous because I'm super autonomous, but that doesn't mean that that's the right characteristic or behavior for the role. And I need to, as an interviewer, change my perspective to understand that everyone has different needs and desires and wants and priorities. And it's in that diversity of thought that you get a really strong population working for you. What are your thoughts?
What we tend to do in the interview process is focus on people's past experiences. It's just a list of things they did, things they accomplished, and skills that they have to move into a more evolved conversation so we can talk about potential. And there aren't good ways in an interview to really talk about potential. There's some tries out there. There's different assessments that put people in a bucket, but that's really just how they're oriented to the workspace. It's not really their potential and how they could thrive. So finding a miss during the interview process is so easy to do because they're so quick to judge. Let's say someone is coming into the interview process and they did have that high level of certainty need, and you can pick up this undercurrent in the conversation about, the past company being upside down, whatever, kind of being wishy-washy and not very clear. You could interpret that as this person doesn't follow directions. They're just an unhappy person. They're just negative. And you could kind of maybe write them off. Imagine, though, if you could say, what does certainty look like for you? Does it mean that you just want a company with a high cash position because your last company folded 3 months after you started? Do you want good communications, two-way communication so that, you're tracking on fast-paced projects? Does it mean that you have a career development path that's very structured and so you have some certainty about where you have opportunities to grow in this role? So there's different ways that you can talk about it. It's a completely different conversation. And when you do that in the interview process and it shows up in the onboarding process and you see it on the job, it becomes an organizational language. We talk about it being in the red or in the blue for any one of these things. If you're in the red, you know that you're at risk for triggering people to withdraw, disengage, or quit. If you're in the blue, now you're creating this positive space to increase certainty, to increase autonomy or align autonomy, to build the relationships appropriately, to be transparent with the fairness and equality that the company is operating under. And then standing. We use standing because it's so big. It's feeling valued. It's feeling respected. Imagine someone has a very high drive to feel valued and recognized. And in that interview, as an employer, you can articulate, let me tell you about our employee recognition program. And let me tell you what I, as a manager, do to showcase my team and reward them in our benefits department, with the year-end bonuses. It could go on and on and on. How good would that feel to know that in the interview?
How frequently does someone need to assess, where they stand within the CARES model? Because I'm sure that like any other psychological assessment or workplace assessment, any type of life-altering moment or life event, where you sit in the model could change. I obviously don't want to assume, but for you, what is like a best practice around that evaluation cadence?
Typically, we recommend starting the CARE survey in the interview phase. And at any given time, you really just focus on the top two. They all matter, but the top two is what's driving decision-making and thoughts at the moment. And we give guidance on certain milestones or triggers where it would be recommended to retake the assessment. And you named them. Any type of material change, like a job change, an organizational change, some type of a marketplace change. And people can just, take it on their own if they want to. We just have it on a per person license. So somebody wants to take it every couple of months, they can. If they want to do it once a year, that they can. It's similar to when you do an employee survey. You do want to keep a pulse on how things are going. You want to look for trends. And the beautiful thing is when you aggregate the data as an organization, you know where to put your resources. If your employee survey keeps saying, we're confused, we don't know what's happening, we need to hear more from leadership, and you have keep showing up that people have a high drive for certainty, there's a gap that you need to bridge. If people are coming to you with a high drive for feeling valued and being recognized, now you know where to put funds into and building out employee recognition programs if you don't already have them. So it's great insights to be able to match in an ongoing fashion what employees need and what you can deliver with, great confidence that you're doing the right thing, because this is all the underpinnings that's happening in the brain.
Right. My final question until you're out of the hot seat on the podcast. And that is from the data that you see and the clients that you have, is there a certain behavior within the CARES model that is more common? Like, is certainty more common? Is autonomy more common in terms of where people sit from their priorities and how they test in this survey?
Well, it will show up differently over time, but in the last 2 years, given all of the financial and pandemic forces at work, certainty has been at the top.
That makes sense.
It's clearly at the top.
Yeah.
Now, that will change over time. But yeah, right now, certainty and feeling valued and standing. So those have been the two that are taking the lead right now. In some subgroups, as you can imagine, equality and fairness has been a hot topic too.
Sure. When we think about where everyone sits within these behaviors, it's clear that every single one is important. And when we think about providing solutions in the sense of ensuring that each person and their needs are met, really you can't go wrong if you're taking like a 5-pronged approach, right? Because CARES, 5-pronged approach. So if you make sure that your approach to employee engagement and satisfaction and recruitment and growth and all of those things hit those targets, I imagine that companies will be a lot better off. And like I said before, I don't have any other questions for you. So you are officially out of the hot seat, but I do want to give you the opportunity to share with the listeners where they can connect with you and learn more about what it is that you do and more about CARES if they were interested in the survey or, even bringing this to their organizations, for example.
You can easily find more information at retainmyteam.com. If you do go there, we actually have for free 25 employee appreciation ideas that work.
Love it.
That you can download. If you're interested in taking the CARES survey for self-discovery or to explore use in your organization, on that same website, after downloading the employee appreciation ideas that work, just book a quick 10-15 minute call with me. We'll get you oriented as to what the survey is and how it can be applied. It's not a sales call, it's an exploratory call, and we'll set you up with a demo.
Amazing. And I will link everything in the show notes. The listeners are used to me saying this at this point, so they already know to go to the show notes to click all the links. So they will be there. And I just really want to say thank you so much for enlightening us today and talking to us about the science behind how we work and how we can really take our understanding of people and humanity in the workplace specifically and elevate that understanding. So thank you so much for being on the podcast and for sharing all of this wonderful knowledge with us.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Tracy. Thank you.